Yeah. How you feeling?
Good.
Yeah?
Good. Yeah, I love the sunshine.
Are you still doing your Lead More podcast?
I'm going to bring it back now.
Are you?
When I applied for this job, I hit 100 episodes and I just paused it for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to decide how it fits in.
Where it goes from here.
But I want to do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Welcome to FrameOne. I'm Drysen. Today I'm hanging out with John Meyer. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks
it.
for having me.
So you have a few things, accomplishments under your belt.
Oh, thanks.
And so I want to go through my research, see if I did everything properly. Let me know if I got this right.
Sure.
In 2009, you started 9 Clouds with your brother, basically working out of your guys' apartment.
Mm-hmm.
A little while into that venture, you hired a gal named Amy Moore, who at one point pitched an idea for an infographic, which led to the birth of Lemonly in 2011.
Yep.
Ran that for a decade. Last January, stepped away from that business to start another, work with NFTs and that fun stuff. And then this last January, started coaching with a company called January, starting your own coaching thing. I'm noticing a January theme going on here. And then also recently, you were promoted or awarded the position of executive director for the Leadership South Dakota.
You got it. All accurate.
All right.
Only thing I always forget that her name's Amy Moore. I always think of her as Amy Colgan because we just called her Colgan. And but yeah, she was our first employee at 9 Clouds, and then a couple years into it, we were, I'd say, fledgling a little bit. Like, people had heard of us, but we weren't. This is my biggest company recommendation. We weren't known for anything, and we said, what if we did a new company and just did one thing really well? And so that's how Amy and I started that. That's
awesome. There's a lot I want to talk about between 9 Clouds, but I want the meat of this to be Lemonly. Okay. Because FrameOne, the point of the podcast, and by the way, this is all unscripted, so wherever we go, we go.
Yeah.
But the point of the podcast is to really help inspire the next generation of freelancers, business owners that want to grow within the creative industry.
Cool.
So it's kind of learning your emotional journey and going from there. So jumping back to the very beginning at 9 Clouds, you started that when you were in your 20s, is that right?
Yeah, I was 23.
23.
Yep.
So I'm curious, I know when I was 23, if my brother and I would have started any business together, that would have been the worst idea ever on the face of the planet.
Fair.
How did that go for you guys, working with family?
It was sort of not an accident, but we both necessity, I guess. Scott, my older brother, was living in Norway, so he went out to Norway for his graduate degree, and then was sort of living visa to visa, however long Norway would let him, 6 months at a time, bartender, tour guide. So he was just looking for a little bit more consistency, which starting a business is not the right answer, but and I, meanwhile, had just graduated college and was working up in Minneapolis in corporate America in consulting. And while it was exciting to be in the big city, and I was hoping I'd get to travel, and I realized that consulting just wasn't quite for me. Spending a lot of time in Excel spreadsheets and doing pivot tables, and I felt like a cog in the wheel a little bit.
Okay.
So Scott was home in South Dakota and in Brookings. And there's an organization in South Dakota called the Enterprise Institute, and they help people start companies. And there was a little brochure for a grant. It was a $15,000 grant with 2 rules. You had to, 1, start your company in South Dakota, and 2, it had to involve technology some way.
Okay.
So it was sort of an economic development grant, Governor Rounds at the time, and we applied for it in a weekend. We just kind of made up this idea for this company. This is the advent of social media, and so the idea was that I think businesses back home in South Dakota maybe don't know how to use all these tools. What if we can come back and teach them that right now people are going online and looking for what you sell. Are they finding you, right?
Yeah.
Pizza, automobiles, whatever you're selling. And so that was the idea. We pitched it, we got the grant, and in June of 2009, we moved home. And so, it was just kind of a harebrained, we were both restless. $15,000 seemed like a lot of money at the time. And so we jumped because of that.
That's really cool. So I'm curious, working with your brother, because I'm imagining working with family in anything, and especially a business, because business can be very stressful at times.
Yeah, for sure.
Was there a strain on that relationship at all? Like you guys no, or was it more we already know how to fight, it's fine, we've got this going?
Maybe in the middle. I think we had to redefine our relationships to some degree. I think strategically why I maybe wouldn't recommend it, at least in our case, is that Scott and I have some similar strengths. Now, we're different for sure, but I think the difference with Amy and I, where we are co-founders sort of on the opposite ends of the talent spectrum in different ways. So that would be less about family dynamics and more about is your brother the ideal co-founder or sister or sibling or whatever?
Right.
In our case, maybe not, but we kind of learned together. And then what Nine Clouds allowed us to, or what Lemonly allowed us to do, is actually kind of trade equity, kind of split the companies apart. And he kept growing one, and Amy and I went off and grew the other.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
There's these rules in business where people are like, never work with family, or I would only work with family. And I think just most things in life and in business are more gray, right? We want to make them black and white, and they're a lot more gray.
I imagine a lot of that is just having clear communication and just being honest about stuff.
100%, which at 23 and 26, we probably didn't have. I think if we were to do it again, we'd be better at that.
There's another question I want to ask you. Being 23 years old when you're starting that company, I know when I was 23, I knew everything. You couldn't teach me anything.
Yeah.
Now that I'm 32, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know anything at this point.
Yeah, that's so true.
How did you feel? Like, were you like on top of the world? We're confident. We're going to crush this? Or was there some hesitation?
Yeah, I probably, that's a good question. I think I've always been pretty humble externally, pretty confident maybe internally. I think that I definitely didn't know how to run a business, and it was obvious that was shown in some of our actions of starting the company, what we charged, how we sold it. But we had an advantage of being like this new emerging technology and sort of these young creative guys. And so people were like, and that sliced both ways. Like it sliced good way in the sense that people were like, yeah, I don't understand Twitter. Like teach me.
Yeah.
It sliced the bad way in that they were like, that's cute. That sounds good, but we're not going to pay for that. We had to do a lot of teaching before we could sell. And I think those types of businesses are tough. And that's actually kind of what I ran into again with No Fun Team and doing NFTs, was trying to pull the market to you. If you have to educate before you can sell, it can be done. It's just
people
more
are like,
difficult.
Why do I need this? I haven't needed it yet. Why do I need it now?
So it slows down your sales cycle. It increases the amount of like content and education you need to make. And we did the wrong assumption. We went home to Brookings thinking that our credibility as locals with my parents would serve us. And I think the opposite happened. It was like, oh, I remember these kids. Like I remember you when you were 10.
Absolutely.
Why would I hire you to grow my business?
And I imagine being young too, people are like, well, you're young. You obviously can't know anything.
A little bit of that.
You don't have the experience yet.
Yeah, a little bit of that. Yeah. So you fight that, and I think you're right about your 20s and 30s, right? You think you know everything, and then you get older and you realize you don't.
Have a lot of learning left to do. So Nine Clouds takes off. It's running. It's doing its thing. And you guys bring on Amy as your first hire.
Yeah.
At what point were you like, we need to bring someone on board for this?
Yeah, so that's a funny story. And like most businesses, I think we always tell a good story, and then there's the real story. So the real story behind why we hired was we had a client in Brookings called the Ram Pub, which is a downtown restaurant. And people won't believe this when they hear it on the show, but in 2009, people didn't know how to put photos on their Facebook page. So Scott and I would drive home to Brookings, which is about an hour from here. We'd go downtown. We'd take a picture of like a Bloody Mary or a margarita. We'd upload it as like the drink of the week, $2 off or whatever it was. Usually they'd give us a free beer while we were sitting there.
Right.
Then we'd drive home and stop at my parents' house and eat a free dinner. And then we'd drive an hour back home. And we did this every week for $200 a month, which was not good business. Like
those perks.
The perks. Yeah, exactly. We were probably losing money on the gas. And we quickly realized this is not a great model. Let's find a college kid to do it. And so we went up to SDSU, Roxanne Lucchese up on SDSU, great instructor. We were like, who are your best students? She gave us 3 names. We interviewed. Amy was actually a advertising and graphic design double major. Okay. And so I remember she was like, well, I'm a designer, but I know how to use Facebook. And we were like, great, maybe she can design us a poster or some table tents or something.
Yeah.
And so that is literally the reason why I met Amy, and Lemonly doesn't exist without that. And so because we didn't want to drive an hour each way to post a picture on Facebook. And I think ironically, her friends, in 2009, again, people can't imagine this world anymore. We're like, wait, you get paid to go to the bar and like post a picture on Facebook? Like, that's the best job ever.
I think I'm more impressed along the lines that you had this thought of, well, rather than saying this account at $200 is not worth it, let's hire someone to do it.
Always try to find a way to like create the margin. Yeah.
Instead of being like, oh, that client that's not paying well enough, we're going to pivot and do something differently. So that's
maybe we should have charged more or fired the client. Yeah, we learned how to do that later.
But building into that, you find Amy, and she comes on board for 9 Clouds at the time. Financially, looking at your banks and that kind of stuff, at what point were you like, okay, this makes financial sense, we can do this, I feel comfortable about that?
Yeah, I suppose for the audience, that's kind of the origin of the question. And I think usually the answer is when you feel like you are just kind of, bleeding on both ends in terms of like, waking up early and doing the work, staying up late and doing the work. In this case with Amy, it was a skill set that we truly didn't have.
Got it.
So when she joined the team, we could now sell things we couldn't do before. I'm more of a storyteller, writer, leader, that person. And Scott's fairly similar, education and training. But we didn't have actual like designer creative.
Right.
So that is sort of different. It was more of making the investment, hoping we could then, but we still were, I always think about it, even at Lemonly, like what's the pipeline look like? How do you feel confident in? The hardest thing about these type of our businesses is sort of the volatile nature of the work met with what you try to build, the consistency of the workforce. So you're a freelancer, and thanks to people like you, we can always like fill in or backfill. But that's the hardest thing. And so, yeah, you got to kind of look at the economics, but I would say, be confident in the sense that when you open up a new service, that you can expand your revenue versus just, can I pay the bills?
I think that's an important point to make. So thinking a little bit more about that, if I understand, I listened to the podcast episode from your Lead More podcast where you were talking about how Amy had pitched the idea of creating an infographic for a project, which led to the entire startup of Lemonly. Which, when I'm thinking about this, to have just a random one-off idea and hearing this thing with the bar and everything else, it sounds like you've had just the entrepreneurial spirit just ingrained into your DNA. Has that always been true?
Yeah, people ask that a lot, like, are entrepreneurs born or are they made? And again, I think it's more gray. It's both.
Okay.
I think I've heard Gary Vee say that he would go pick the flowers from the neighbor's yard and then go ring their doorbell and sell them back to them. I wasn't that way, but I do think I was always a little bit of like a negotiator. So like baseball cards, like trading baseball cards. I was always trying to collect all the Ken Griffey Juniors was like my vintage. I'm 37, so he was like the guy. I always tell this story. This guy in my Brookings high school class, Reza, he's a magician. And if you're from South Dakota, you've maybe seen Reza do a show. And one time in middle school, he gave me a magic trick and sort of taught me the secret of how to do it. Yeah. And in exchange, I did his history homework. And
I think you came out ahead on that one.
So I was like, yeah, I can do your homework and teach me this magic trick. So I'd say that part, which is part of business, right? Like I have this, you have that, kind of getting them to, understand the value of what you have.
Yeah.
And I would say even in my adult life, a lot of people, and this is maybe a challenge for freelancers, don't like to own the title of being in sales.
Right. Sales are icky. They're gross.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm a designer. Like I don't do sales.
Right.
It's like, well, it's really hard to grow your freelance business without being able to do sales.
Absolutely.
And if you position that and change that into, it doesn't even, you can use the word sales or not. I don't think it's an icky word, but I'm just trying to solve your problem, trying to present something of value. You can decide what it's worth. Here's what I think it's worth. It's just a negotiation. And so I think that part maybe I did have as a child. I didn't give my dad enough credit. He's an orthodontist. So I thought of that as like, dental school, like graduate dental school and then orthodontic school and very more linear.
Okay.
But he's a small business owner. He had employees, he had rent.
Still at sales.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I saw it more than I realized growing up.
That's a perfect segue, though, to starting Lemonly, because knowing that story where Lemonly's origin story, for lack of a better word, was, I think we can do this as a pitch project, as an infographic, and then starting an entire industry or company off of that. Because especially around South Dakota, like infographics as a product or service really don't exist around here before Lemonly did that.
Yep.
So when you have this new thing where you're like, hey, we can make this, to turn that from an idea to the powerhouse that was nationally known, i.e. Lemonly, how does that process look like?
Yeah, certainly like the 10-year overnight success, right? As folks think. Now, a couple things. We got lucky in terms of the timing. If you go do a Google search trend of the term infographic, there's like this hockey stick that happens in like 10 and 11, and we started in 11.
Okay.
And so like you can kind of, I like to joke you can put Lemonly in and then you see the hockey stick. But that's not true. We started at the right time. So a little luck there. But I always use this line at Nine Clouds where people knew who Scott and I were. They were like, in Sioux Falls, they're like, hey, the social media brothers.
Yeah.
But what do you do? And like, we could never, because we did a focus group. Amy would design websites. We would run your Twitter account. We would do
everything.
Yeah, I always joke, whatever it was, if it was legal, we'd do it, right? if you could pay us.
I like money.
Yeah. And that wasn't because we were trying to get as much money as like we were kind of taking whatever we could get.
Right.
Because I have stories for off the podcast of some of the projects we've done. And I realized like, man, we're working it's the smarter versus harder, right? We were working hard trying to teach people about what we could do. What if we just did one thing really well? And so honestly, Lemonly was sort of this little underneath side project. We gave it a little domain, put it over here, and just kind of thought, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Corey Myers from the Argus Leader at the time, we did our first project for $300. And then people just kept asking. And so we're like, wait, we might be onto something here.
The light bulb went off.
Yeah. And let's like kind of double down on that. Let's push that one thing. And the secret, of course, is 10 years later, Lemonly does a lot of types of content. But if you go to the website, it still says like an infographic company. And so that really was like our wedge into the marketplace. That's how people heard about us. That's how they knew about us. Word of mouth is so powerful in our type of business, in our world. Someone says, you need an infographic, you think of Lemonly.
Right. So that's so cool. I'm curious then, because you had this one little service that took off and it works. Were there other things at Nine Clouds that you're just like, trying to put a little bit of thought into and a little, let me rephrase that a little bit better. With Nine Clouds, it sounds like you're kind of chasing it with a kind of a shotgun approach. Let's try everything at once, all at once. Lemonly was very like scalpel, laser focus, laser precision. Were there other things you're trying out simultaneously that you didn't pan out nearly as well, where Lemonly's timing just got lucky, or were there other things that just led to the success?
Yeah, great question. I think a combination, like timing was definitely a thing, but also clarity of value. Like, we were selling the JPEG, but what we were really selling was clarity. Our mission was we design clarity. And so an infographic isn't like a hot new thing. We've used pictures to describe things
since the birth of humanity.
Exactly, right? Cave paintings on the wall, hieroglyphics. So that is a concept people could grasp. And what you were really buying was understanding. Like, I would say the world's a confusing place. Like, let us make it simple.
Yeah.
And you can kind of get behind that.
Absolutely.
Whereas a lot of the things in the early days, and I will say Nine Clouds has since fixed this, but when Scott and I were running it, was a lot of, hey, you should be on Twitter. Like, it's kind of the new thing. Maybe you'll find some customers. It's these demographics, and there's a little bit more convincing, right? Versus just a natural, yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And it's the classic, like, is your service a pain or a painkiller or a vitamin, right? And so when I think about new entrepreneurial ideas, I have a lot of vitamin ideas, right? Like, that would be cool if, or that sounds fun, or what if, but then you're having all these, like, if all these things go right, this could be a good business. And right now, if I walk outside and see someone who doesn't have a coat, and it's 12 degrees outside, I think I could probably sell them a coat, right? Like, that's a pain, right? And so I think thinking about your business that way is a way to frame it.
I love that. So let's dive into Lemonly a little bit more. This thing started as basically a side project, now that I'm understanding, to a absolute powerhouse of infographics, advertising, just design in general, like you said, design and clarity. And one thing I've noticed locally here is Lemonly is the company that if anybody goes to school for graphic design or any illustration, like, they want to work there.
Cool.
And there's a reason for that. That's the company culture you built. So I'm curious, as you're starting this, I hate calling it a side project, but that's at the time it was.
Yeah, sure.
How did company culture play a role into that from the early beginning?
I think that's also a misnomer we hear of these great places to work, as if we had whiteboarded the next 5 to 10 years, here's what the company culture will look like, right? It's not that. That's not how it works. I'm a big believer that a culture really takes on the identity of the founders or the leaders. So treating people the way that I was raised to treat people, or collaborate, work with people I want to work with, or who we share same values.
Yeah.
And so that it really just started like that. Like, you interview somebody, you get a good fit, good vibe, you're like hanging out with them. They seem to be hard workers. You tell them what you care about. You get, all right, let's try it. And we were just a couple 20-somethings in an office for a while. But then when I started realizing like, okay, we're in a services company, which means all of our assets, and I hate using that word, but the most valuable thing we have, they walk out the door every day, the people.
Yeah.
If I do something wrong and tomorrow they all come in and quit, there is no business, right? Lemonly just doesn't exist.
That's a scary thought. I'm going to move this table out of the way here.
Sure, I could maybe go find... Yeah, maybe I could find new designers, but the cost of that and starting over and it'd just be very difficult. And so that's when we started realizing like, oh, our only sort of bottleneck is human capital and talented designers.
Yeah.
So like, what if we could make it the coolest place to work in the Midwest? And I used to tell Amy, I was like, why don't we just get all the best designers in Sioux Falls to work at Lemonly? And then let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there was a window where we did that. And so,
financially, I imagine that's super scary to do, though.
Yeah, you had to. So, like, part of our origin story too is we had one really. If you were to write the biography or the memoir of Lemonly, you'd have to talk about Marriott, and so that was one of our large clients that really took us off. Where we did one infographic for them as like a test versus our largest competitor. They liked us enough to win that account.
Did Amy design that one?
Amy did, yeah.
Slow clap for her.
And then we also had, I don't know if you know Kyle Muchelnaus, really talented designer from South Dakota. He now does his own studio. He on the Spotify, like Spotify Wrapped, like the annual report.
Yep.
He does like this motion text stuff that
nice.
created for them, New York Times. Like he was one of our early, I always joke, so my brother, who's now an orthodontist in Brookings, bought my dad's practice, was on the first version of the Lemonly website. Kyle Muchelnaus. Like we had all these people, like only 2 people were like actually employed by Lemonly, but we had about 6 people on the website. Yep. Because they did one thing one time to help us out.
They did it really well.
Yeah, exactly. And so I always think, when you're small, you try to look big, and when you're big, you try to act small. Like if you go down to Coca-Cola on Minnesota Avenue, they'll be like, hey, Bruce will help you out here. Like talk to Bruce. And so my brother actually always jokes when we went to dental school, and everybody does the same damn things, internships and experiences and clubs. So in the interview for something different, they'd be like, what's an information architect? And he would tell about the 4 months he lived on my couch and worked at Lemonly. And so I don't remember the origin of your question.
we were talking about the financial investment in order to be able to do the top of
Marriott,
designers.
Yeah. So Marriott went from 1 to 6 to 12, and then I remember the day they said, like, could you guys make 80 infographics? And I'm doing the math in my head of what we charge for an infographic. I'm like, yeah, we could do that. And then in the back of my mind, I'm like, we can't do that. Like, we don't have the bandwidth to do that. But you say yes, and you figure it out.
Right. So at that point, it's basically a big number came in. You're like, all right, we've got the account, we've got financing coming in. Now we just have to go hire people to make it.
A little bit, yeah. And then eventually we grew other clients to kind of dilute that number. There was a time I always tell now as a coach with services companies, you got to be careful to let one client be too large.
Right. We want to diversify a little bit.
Exactly.
So
one year they were about 44% of our business. That's a lot.
Oh, wow.
And so the hope was to dilute it by growing others. And we were working on it, and then they did really pull down one year. So that was a growing pains year. But
at that point, though, were you able to diversify enough where it wasn't? I mean, obviously it's still around. You survived.
Yeah, nobody lost their job or anything like that. We just had to. Yeah, we kind of learned the hard way of diversifying our clients.
Gotcha. So talk to me a little bit about once you figured out how to build company culture. How did you make that an intentional part of Lemonly?
Yeah. I think that's one thing I'm really proud of is that now the things that we were doing, that people do in 22, 23, we were doing in 13, 14, 15. And honestly, a lot of that is just like flexibility. Like people wanted to be able to integrate their personal life and their professional life, work from home, like use technology, get your work done when you can. We had already seen at that era Google putting beer in the fridge or ping pong tables, right? And we were like, what if we go beyond that? And we'd ask people to rank the things that matter most to them, right? PTO or their job title or the clients they get to work with. And we'd always say like, all these things matter, but what matters to you most, Drysen? And maybe 3 years from now, that'll change because you're starting a family. And we try to like tailor their experience to their personal needs, which I always tell small companies, like, use your advantage of being small. If you're 80,000 employees, you can't do that. HR can't like make custom offers to everybody. So like, use your unique DNA. And so that was kind of what we did. And in about 2015 or 14, I think, I decided, let's just start talking about this. And so we started putting it on the blog. We actually did about 6 episodes of a podcast that we didn't get very far in, but about our culture. We would tackle a different policy on each episode.
That's kind of cool.
And my hope then, that was more of just an altruistic, like, we're going to kind of step out front and try to be a leader in at least our state, and maybe other companies will follow.
Was that scary, or was that like something that emboldened you?
I think it pushed us to be even a better culture, because we had to like back up what we were saying, right? Like everything we were saying was true, but you had to like live it, right? Like kind of like practice what you preach, or put your money where your mouth was, right? If we were going to say we do this and this and this for our employees, but our employees were like, no, you don't. Like that would have all fallen apart. If
I remember it, you guys were one of the first companies that actually in this area worked remote before working remote was cool. Yeah.
Our first employee in 2011 was from Serbia. So Amy and I, and then we hired her.
Yeah.
Never actually physically got to meet her. She worked for us for about 3 years, though.
That's awesome.
We were going to bring her over, and then she had a baby, and it's just like timing didn't work out. But so we did that. I mean, that was Skype, so we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have Slack,
all the important stuff.
Yeah. So, what COVID did do for us, though, is I always thought we were very remote work friendly, but we weren't like a remote first type of environment or hybrid or whatever. Where we had to, I recognized during COVID, it's a different experience for those inside the 4 walls than those outside. How do we kind of try to synchronize that?
Yeah.
And then now I'm proud when I sometimes see or hear about different companies in Sioux Falls and their culture or their benefits. And I see it on the page. I'm like, oh yeah, I think that we might have maybe inspired them a little bit.
That's really cool. I love that. I want to kind of cycle back to sales for just a minute. That first thing with Marriott that you presented and landed that account, at what point did you feel comfortable and confident enough to say, yes, we as Lemony are good enough, we're going to approach national big name companies like this and actually chase these accounts?
Yeah, I would say either never or always. And what I mean by that is like, it wasn't people like, how do you get these big brands? And it was, again, also a combination of a little bit of luck in terms of timing and then good SEO, like because we were so specific and everything on our website talked about being an infographic company. I think still today, if you Google like infographic agency, infographic company, we're 1 or 2 result. And so we were really built on inbound request. And I remember that, especially the early days, Netflix would pop up.
Yeah.
Or, Disney filled out our form, and there was just, that was really cool.
I bet.
Eventually it's sort of like you meet these people and you're like, oh, they're just like us.
Right.
And so then you do, some of the intimidation sort of fades away. But I will say, like in those early days, pre-Zoom, and we were in South Dakota, so we did all these on Skype.
Yep.
And often didn't turn the video on because like video back then wasn't very good.
Right.
And like laggy. And I think there was a little bit of a veil that we could hide behind to make them realize like we're just like 25 and 24. Like they probably shouldn't trust these, this brand new agency in South Dakota. So maybe like there was probably a little bit of lack of confidence that we sort of, I guess you could say, fake it till you make it.
Do you think the branding you guys put in place really helped to push those inbound sales?
Yeah, maybe. We want it to feel fresh and clean, definitely the name. I will say, again, I think that's another startup myth, is that there's so much strategy in branding. I think usually a brand is more how you make it after the fact. So the joke is, of course, that we were lemon.ly. We didn't have the .com at first. There's a funny story to how we obtained that. But, one time I was on a radio show and the lady's like, oh, I get it. Like Meyer, lemons, Lemonly, Meyer lemons. And literally, I never thought. I paused and I was just like, yeah, sure. Like
totally meant it that way. Yeah.
The whole way. And so, then Amy had the idea. One year we sent infographic with lemon-themed cocktail recipes.
Nice.
Everything was in the kit and the infographic.
Now that's what we needed for this interview.
Yeah,
today.
we should have brought those. I think they're still in the back of Lemonly. So yeah, I think a brand is more what you make it. But even, back to the 9 Clouds comparison, it was just a lot easier at Lemonly when you're creating content. And what are we talking about? We're talking about clarity. We're talking about confusing to simple. We're talking about infographics. Whereas 9 Clouds, we had so much more coverage. We were trying to talk about, growing a digital agency. You have websites. You have brands. You have domains. You have pay-per-click. You got social. You got, you got funnels. You got inbound marketing. Just a little bit more complicated.
So as I'm listening to you talk, the one thing that just keeps like ringing in the back of my mind is that you might not have all the answers, but just go try it. Just go out, just try and see what happens.
I think, I'm big on that. I'm big on being known for something.
Okay.
And that doesn't have to put you in a box. Like I said, Lemonly, we do a lot of they do a lot of animation. We started creating micro content where we would kind of have all these add-ons or bundles on top of the infographic. We can turn it into social cuts. We can make it into a poster. We can trade show banners. Yeah. So we were kind of trying to increase the average checkout size. I kind of like to call it.
Absolutely.
We weren't e-commerce.
It's the candy bar at the checkout counter.
Totally. We weren't limited to infographics, but we were known for infographics, and that was like our wedge into these organizations.
Okay. So as you're putting your pricing and packaging together, you mean animation, motion graphics, infographics? It's all abstract. Like there's no like tangible. This is a piece of gold that's going to cost you X amount. How did you come to your pricing model that you're going to be like, this is what we're going to charge?
Yeah, a lot of iteration. We went from $300 to eventually $6,000-$7,000. I'd say a combination of just usually, honestly, in the beginning, it was keep raising the price until people say no, and then kind of settle at that price for a while. And then when everyone keeps saying yes again, we'll keep going up. I know there are companies that pay analysts. I had a friend who worked at Target who was in like milk.
Yeah. And
their job every day was to figure out the price of milk everywhere across the country and what it's going to cost. And that was not our approach. But I did take a little, we started to talk to other agencies, got a sense of like what hourly rates, should be. About 95% of Lemonly's revenue was like project-based revenue. So I was really trying to move away from the hourly rate model. Now we track time. We use a tool called Harvest. We track all of our time. We internally would be like, was this project profitable? But externally, I wanted you to say yes as soon as possible. I think there's a lot of magic in making the sales process like smooth and fast. We found that at about 14 days, if we didn't close a lead after about 2 weeks, it was gone. Really unlikely that we were going to get them. Occasionally, you got the email a couple months later, sorry, we forgot about you. We'd like to move forward. So my philosophy was like, how do we get people from I'm interested to signing a contract as fast as possible? And that starts like, menus and set prices and clarity of timeline. This is a 4-week project. It's $5,000. There'll be 2 rounds of edits in each phase. Can I take your credit card? And we actually didn't take credit cards over the phone like that, but as quick as possible to yes. If we were selling clarity, the process had to be clear too, right? Like we had to embody. And in 2018, when we switched we did Traction, this agency model of operations, and we came up with this We Design Clarity thing. And we really took it to heart, not just externally. You're not just buying clarity, but we're going to use it internally.
Yeah.
And you might know like Michael Mazurek from our team. He's one of my favorite employees. He always has a lot of questions. He's curious. And, he'd raise his hand and be like, this policy doesn't really make sense. And in a way, I'd be like, well, we just walked through the whole thing. Like, what didn't make sense? But I'm like, if anybody had a question, then we could do better. Like,
right.
It could be more clear.
Right.
It could be more simple. So I'm always grateful for Michael, who always raises his hand. But I thought of that as a sales process too. So back to your question, I'm big on like project-based pricing, ease of saying yes. We tried when these bigger companies started coming in, we were like, should we charge more to Netflix
just because they're big
than the nonprofit in Sioux Falls? And we tried, but honestly, we didn't have a great CRM. And so I was like, I couldn't remember the price I gave one client. And we just said, screw it. this is what an infographic costs. We know if we're doing our process, this will be profitable. And in the project-based model, you're going to have some projects you might lose on, but then you have that project Brett would send a wireframe approved, design draft approved, and then you're looking at your profit and you're like, dang, that was a good little project.
So it sounds like you're even designing simplicity from your workflow.
Yeah,
everything.
100%. 100%.
I mean, so realistically, it sounds like Lemonly is just simplicity is what your product was, period.
Yeah, I like that. I've never thought about that, but yeah, I think so. I think that's part of what made it so special. I was proud that when we also went through the process of merging, I think a lot of those things got carried through. And so I would always use my little imposter syndrome of owning a design agency, and I don't know how to use Photoshop, which I always say pretty overtly. In the early days, I was going through a lot of imposter, like, hey, here's this Amy, this really talented designer, all these other people, and I'm just like selling things.
Right.
But then I was like, hey, design is sort of capital D at Lemonly. We design the office, we design the sales process, we design our internal operations. And I was like, I can do this.
I'm curious on the studio front then, was having a studio location, a physical building, brick and mortar, beneficial to Lemonly, or did it matter at all?
I think definitely in the formational years of a culture was super huge. So like we could be known as a good place to work, but you could really feel it, I think, when you came into the studio. And so I almost think in 2023 that might be less impactful because we've all gone to hybrid or we're more used to Zoom and remote. But in those teen years, it was pretty powerful, I think.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So through the years of Lemonly, did you ever find yourself at a point where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe we just landed that. I can't believe we just made this sale. What was a moment where you were just like blown away that you'd accomplished X, Y, Z?
Yeah, I remember I had Amy take a picture when I signed the Major League Baseball contract.
Yeah?
Because just that idea of signing a Major League Baseball, that was like my childhood dream. And then, of course, you quickly realize I'm not good enough at baseball. But it was an MLB contract now in exchange for design services and not playing center field for the Twins. But that was like kind of a pinch me moment of like, that's cool. And then certain projects, of course, that we're super proud of. We did an annual report for the 9/11 Memorial Museum out in New York City. Yeah, I would say the novelty wears off a little bit, and that's not in like a not appreciative way. It's actually more of just like a realization that these people are just like us, and they're hiring us because they want clarity and they want simplicity. And
I imagine the more you do it too, the more it's like this is natural.
Yeah. I think gaining confidence that you're good at what you do is one of the hardest things of being a creative or a solopreneur or running a studio. And sometimes you need those little benchmarks or checkpoints to meet others and be like, yeah, I got this. So I think it's a huge part is your mindset and belief of your ability. So yeah.
I think we can all agree that positivity is a great thing. We love it. But there are times in business where it's challenging. Things are hard. Maybe they don't go the way you want them to.
Yeah.
Can you speak to any challenges or any things that Lemonly had to overcome?
Yeah, definitely. I think certainly that Marriott year when we had a huge reduction in our largest client and were able to not have to like lay anybody off was a challenging year. Took a little bit of I think that's probably in the second half of Lemonly where I gained a more appreciation for leadership and the burden that an entrepreneur carries. Because when you get off that phone call internally inside a room by yourself, a lot of thoughts are running through your head of, can I pay these people? Are we going to make it? Will we survive? Did I just turn something that was valuable into something that's no longer valuable? You always kind of go to bed thinking the whole thing's just going to fall apart.
Absolutely.
And I think that's pretty common for entrepreneurs. But then you step out of the building or out of that room and everyone's working and just doing their job and doing what you're asking them to do. And you kind of got to just show up and be there for them and be the person that they need you to be. Right. So that's a particular moment that stands out. I think I've always said as an entrepreneur, you get a little numb, which I'm a little bit mixed feelings about, like, because it's just like life's not quite as exciting when like the highs are not as high and the lows are not as low.
Right.
But actually, it's a little bit what you need to kind of navigate, because sometimes all this can happen in the span of a day. Like, oh, we just got our biggest client of the year, and then 2 hours later, your star employee like took a new job.
Yeah.
And you're just like, whoa, roller coaster. And I think I just over time just got a little bit more numb, and everything kind of came a little bit more into the middle, as probably a coping mechanism, to be honest.
But those swings are pretty extreme and pretty. They take an emotional toll on you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I tried to be very clear at the end of Lemonly, especially when we sold, that this was just such a, it's the classic, like, it takes a village to raise a child. Like, there were so many people on this journey, from Julie, our CPA, to Paul, our lawyer, to, every employee who wore the title of a lemon head. Like, it really is a collaborative team effort. And even on a small company, I think you would say that solo person, your spouse, your family, so many people involved in making it all work.
So when you're bringing on employees and you're building this team, I would imagine you get very much like a family bond, where you're like, these people are the closest people to me. They're the most important people in my life. I want to make sure they're taken care of.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that your finances are able to support that?
Sure.
And they're able to be financially, like, what am I trying to say here? How do you ensure that your books match being able to pay people what they're worth?
Yeah. Good question. So first I'll say, we always try to say we were a team and not a family. I think we were doing this culture stuff for a while, and then that was the thing that I noticed in the space, and not calling any companies out, but there was like...
Family became cliche.
Yeah. And I was like, wait a minute, I got a family at home, and you got a family at home, and I'm not asking you to be our family. I'm paying you to do a job.
Make me supper.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the sports analogy of, like, a team would be optimized. We have, a basketball team's got a point guard and they got a center, and we have all these different specialists. And, every year we're chasing this common goal of this trophy. And some years, we might have to, like, hey man, you probably should retire. You're at the end of the line, or like, we're going to bring in the new rookie. And so I like that analogy. So we tried to kind of think team, but you're right. Like, the blood, sweat, and tears brings you pretty close. And I always think any one-on-one meeting with people that reported to me, the first thing was like, how's your family? How was your weekend? You follow them on Instagram nowadays. Yeah. I saw it was Thomas's birthday. Like, that was awesome. But in terms of the financial thing, I think a really strong financial advisor. I'm big now in doing coaching. I've been pushing all my agencies to get scorecards. Like, we need some KPIs. We need scorecards. Like, look, I'm not a CFO. I'm not an accountant. Like, I don't consider myself a numbers oriented person. I'm a creative storyteller. But once you get your hands around it and you feel confident, it lets you make these decisions not on a whim. And you're now saying, like, okay, once we get to X clients, we can hire a designer. That's going to increase our margin by X. And I know that if we can get to the goal that we set by Y, I'm going to be able to take a distribution of Z, right? Like,
so you're able to formulate it.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And you don't have to be the one to figure that out. Like, that's what, like, CPAs or accountants or coaches can help you do. And so all of my clients now have a scorecard, and it's so cool. I'm a big believer then in also pushing that scorecard X to the team. And so everybody at Lemonly during my time there should know if we were having a good week or a good month or a bad month. Which
transparency,
honestly,
that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's scary, but also it's like, it takes a lot of burden off your shoulders. Like, and I think people are self-motivated to like, they want to make that box green and not red.
They want to do more than just be a paycheck. Yeah. They want to be more.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe, people will often say, oh, I'm not a very competitive person. I think everybody's competitive, at least with their self. It may not be like, we're playing a match, well, somebody's going to win, someone's going to lose. We can both win. But I individually, John, want to be better than I was before. But to do that, I need to know the rules of this game. Like, how do I score? How do we win the game? So for Brett, a designer, it was like, hit these billable hours. For me or Jade as a salesperson, it was take X amount of sales calls. For Nick, the marketing person, to get the sales calls, we need people to sign up for our email list, right? And you just build this funnel, and the scorecard kind of moves its way down, and then hopefully dollars are at the bottom.
So throughout all of my research of business and finance and everything else I've been doing for the last decade, I feel like you just like put a missing piece to my knowledge base together. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you bet. Well, and what you'll find is it becomes this cycle. So like, you'll fix a problem in your business and it'll probably create another problem. And I mean, good problems. So we are really focusing on marketing. I'm doing a podcast. More people need to know about my studio. Okay, great. Now all these people are calling us. So sales is pretty busy because shit, I got to send all these proposals and I got to answer these phone calls. I got to get back to him. Okay, you fixed that. You've closed more proposals. Okay, so now you got to go do the work, right? And so you have a delivery challenge, and then you get it all done. Maybe you need to hire more people because you're so busy.
Right.
Well, then you need more sales, right? And so it does create this cycle. But if you think of it that way, it's like, I'm going to break this intentionally, and then I'll fix it. It'll break the next thing, and we're just going to keep spinning this cycle and like kind of moving it faster and moving it bigger.
I love that. I love that. Did you have a mentor throughout all this?
Yeah. So for 3 years, I hired my own CEO coach. His name's Dan Martell. He actually just wrote a really great book called Buy Back Your Time so that's another thing I focus on with my coaching clients is leveraging. It's really hard to be, a lot of times, I'm guessing this would be you as well. Like you start doing something in the services or creative work because you love to do it.
Right.
And you're probably good at it. And
I like to think so.
Yeah. And then people say, I'll pay you to do it. Okay, cool. And now all of a sudden you have a business, and maybe you didn't plan on having a business. And that was always the irony when I looked at my team and they walk out the door at the end of the day. I'm like, to your point about money, I was sometimes felt guilty. I was like, I think they could probably go make more money on their own.
Yeah.
But then you realize that a lot of people don't want to do all that other stuff.
Because then they don't get to design.
Exactly. It is sort of this catch-22 as like a solopreneur, which is, I think, your audience. And so you either have to get really good where you can like really be top of market, be the Rolex of your craft, or you kind of got to grow through it. You kind of got to grow through the pains of adding people. And this is my personal philosophy, I guess. And so, so I had a mentor for 3 years, and actually that's sort of how January was built. Was somebody asked me this fall if I thought about coaching, and I was like, I don't think so. And then I paused and was like, wait, I had a really good coach for 3 years that really impacted me. I can do this, and so I did that. Talked about it on social media, and 2 other people asked me, and now I have 6 agencies that I coach. So.
That's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So one thing, I know we're getting kind of close to our time limit here, and I know you've got a hard out today. So I wanted to ask you, because you've gone through it, growing an agency from nothing to actually selling it, hitting the end of the road, so to speak. Talk to me about those emotions, that strategy, all that other fun stuff.
Yeah. So in the fall of 19, I was actually at a session with a coach of mine, and on that flight to San Diego, I read this book a friend of mine wrote called The Messy Marketplace, and it's about selling your company. And there was like 7 reasons why you could sell your company, and it was family, health, I can't remember all the reasons, succession plan, but one of them was like you want to wake up and think about something else. And I remember I read that chapter, and it kind of turned a light bulb on my head. I was like, oh, there's permission to maybe think about something else. There's more beyond
what I've already done.
And there was never about a lack of love for Lemonly, or we were financially strong. We grew through COVID. It was just like, I think I want to think about something else, if that's okay. And I remember telling my wife, I think I'm going to try to sell the company. And in 2020, it started, and I'm kind of a believer in manifesting what you want into the world.
Yeah.
I'm a very open, transparent person. So if you have coffee with me, you'll probably get what's on my mind. And I was talking about it and kind of I don't know, I think someday I'll sell the company. And I happened to be at the right type of coffee meeting when I talked about that. And that's what led us down the path with ClickGrain. But lots of emotions for sure. There was excitement, there was joy, there was sort of this feeling of finality, like you reach this finish line, which I will say is not true. I think entrepreneurs feel this pressure that you don't make it until you sell a company. Yeah. That's definitely not true. I probably love even more the people that run companies for 25, 30 years. That's super impressive. I just knew that wasn't me.
Right.
And so there's also some guilt. I felt, am I letting my team down? It was nothing to do, there's feelings of, is it going to change? All these things.
Right. You built this very specific, special thing.
Yeah. And then even after, we sold it in January of 21, but there was a 12-month earn-out process. And so finished in 22. And then you go from having all these people who sort of depend on you, and then you're just, John sitting at home, you're not the CEO of Lemonly anymore. And that's a good humbling experience. And it kind of makes you put in check the roles and labels we give ourselves, right? CEO is so much of who I was, but it's I'm still a dad and a husband and a runner and an entrepreneur, just not of Lemonly anymore. So that was a good growing process too.
Finding out there's a life outside of work. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to your point about, they're not family, but a lot of them I'm still really good friends with, and I want to root for them and cheer them on. And I like to use sports analogies, and I use the one about a coaching tree. You'll talk about a football coach has all these coaches who go on to be coaches at other places, and so many lemon heads have gone on to start businesses, or now we have people at Facebook and Microsoft and IBM, and
that's got to feel pretty cool.
Like it's cool. Yeah, it's super cool that if someone can maybe look back and be grateful for that period of their life.
Right. You had a small touch point in someone's lives in direction. I love that. I love that. So as you had decided that, yes, I'm going to sell the company, I'm going to move on, at that point, did you start training the team to be able to run without you? Had you already built that rollout where the team could operate?
Yeah, good question. I mentioned Traction briefly earlier. So it's EOS. It's called the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and the book is called Traction. I don't think we sell Lemonly without that. Not because it was like the book, but it was what happened when we started that process is it was like I started letting go of more things.
Yeah.
People had clarity of like what they owned, and like our leadership team of 5 really was like we each knew our spot. And so when it comes to selling a company, especially a services company, people are worried about, well, what happens when Drysen leaves or John or Amy? And they felt some confidence that everyone else could cover. And then of course that's where the 12 months comes in, is like handing those roles off. We did like 100-day kind of rollout period. For 6, 7, 8 months, very little changed. And then in the fall, I started kind of slowly backing away. And, but yeah, I think you need good org structure, clarity of roles and responsibilities. It's a weird feeling in the negotiation part. I've told this to other people, is like, you're trying to tell a buyer, and we had a couple of buyers at the table. Yes, this is a really great company. We built this company, and I was important, but also like I'm not important at all. Like it was this weird, like, you have to like, you're pitching the value of the thing while also trying to make yourself seem not important.
Right.
Because they have to think about a world without you.
Exactly.
And now that's not always the case. Sometimes founders stay in acquisitions, but I didn't want to. And so that was a weird kind of mental gymnastics.
Absolutely. So I think a lot of people that watch this show, if they're just starting studios, finding a partner to partner with, may or may not have been thinking about an exit strategy, operating agreements, all that other fun stuff.
Yeah.
When Lemonly started, did you have an operating agreement? At what point did you say, when I decide to leave someday 100 years from now, what am I going to do?
Yeah. I heard on an agency podcast, I remember when I started thinking about selling it was like, you should start 5 years in advance. And I was like,
and you're like, uh-oh.
I don't want to wait 5 years. Yeah. I think I ended up being 2 probably from when I did it. So it does take time. But outside, the only reason we did have the operating agreement is when Scott and I split kind of 9 Clouds and Lemonly. My attorney friend Paul helped us set that up.
Yeah.
But Amy and I never thought of it as like a selling thing. It was just I own 2/3 and you own 1/3. And the only reason that was Scott and Amy and I were a third.
Right.
And I essentially traded my 9 Clouds equity with Scott, and so I became 2/3. And there are probably much better strategic ways to do it than what I did. But I didn't have that outcome in mind. I was surprised how many people locally came up to me and said, I didn't know you could sell a services company or an agency. And I was like,
why not?
You can sell anything if it's of value. And so I would say my advice would be, don't overthink it. Like, don't let that be the reason you don't start something, right? Because just like you hit on at the beginning, Lemonly was a side hustle, like a random idea, and then look at what it became. And that's really the true kind of rags to riches story. It's just what you can accomplish in a decade, right? We often oversell or overestimate what we can do in a year, but underestimate what we can do in a decade. Yeah. And I will always look back at that as probably the most fun decade of my life, I imagine, in many ways. I wouldn't let it be the reason you don't start, but at the same time, consider all possibilities, right? Like, we really didn't seek a buyer. I knew that someday I might have a conversation. And I honestly thought it would be someday I'd be a Marriott or a Disney, like an existing client would say, come just do this for us. So you got to be ready for all potential options.
Love it. I love it. Well, you provided a lot of value here today for us. So I want to give you a chance to kind of provide you some value, talk about January a little bit.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to know more about that.
Yeah. So again, in the spirit of all the little lessons, the difference of could I do this at 9 Clouds versus what if we did this at Lemonly? Right now I'm trying to help agency founders who are growing toward their first $1 million in revenue. So my persona is someone who's busy, who's overworked, probably started it because they love to do it, and now they have a team and they're like, whoa, what happened? They're profitable and they're growing, but they got to get their hands around it. So systems, processes, we're accelerating sales, maybe hiring an assistant or delegating some work so you can do what I call your zone of genius, and get past that $1 million in revenue.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of my sweet spot customer, and I really like it because I get to kind of dip in and pretend to be part of these companies. We do like a one-on-one call. We do a group call where all the agencies come together. And then I use a tool called Voxer, which is like a walkie-talkie.
I use it all the time, actually.
Yeah. So add me on Voxer. Hit me up if you ever need any help. And I love to just asynchronously respond to a proposal or a question or employee issue. So
love it.
So yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for being part of FrameOne.
Drysen.
I appreciate it. Anybody watching, subscribe, definitely help out a ton. And thanks again for watching FrameOne.